What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and it's good to be back in my home studio. And today we're going to be doing a video on day 6 of the World Series of Poker main event. We're going to look at some of the interesting hands, talk about who's building up a stack, and give you a rundown of what happened today going into day 7. But before we jump into that really quick, I want to let you guys know that today is finally the drawing for the giveaway. We're giving away $25,000 to first place and $500 to 10 people. So if you've not yet entered, you have one last chance to do so. And we're going to be doing a live stream over on Facebook at Doug Polk Poker at 7 p.m. Pacific time, where we will be choosing those winners live. So enter the contest, and I'll see you guys over on Facebook. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at what stacks were like coming into day 6 of the World Series of Poker main event. Here we have a list of the players exiting day 5, and you can see players starting to toy with the idea of having an 8-figure stack, but no one ending the day over 10 million. Rubin came in first place, 9.99 million chips, and then there were some players in that 8 to 9 million range, including Joshua Horton, Frank Crivello, and Damian Salas. Also notable, Max Silver in third created the Snapshove app and is a well-known mid to high-stakes poker player, so certainly at least one reg kind of closing out the top 10 of the field, well, being in third place, but in the top 10 of the field. I also want to give a quick shout out to both Poker News and WSOP.com. That's where we're going to be getting these updates. So if you guys want to check them out on your own, the links are in the description below. One additional storyline coming into day 6 before we take a look at a few hands was Chris Ferguson is leading the Player of the Year race. Now there are 2 players left in the field that could potentially catch him, Kenny Howlett and Dario Sammartino. However, if one of those 2 doesn't make a final table run and get deep from there, then we will have Chris Ferguson as our World Series of Poker Player of the Year. And I know there are some people that are not happy about that, but you know what? It is what it is. The guy put together quite the impressive string of min cashes, and I mean, that's got to be worth something, right? Also, let me know in the comments below, what do you think about Chris Ferguson potentially and probably winning Player of the Year? Should he get a banner up just like everyone else? I mean, he also didn't win a bracelet, so does he just have, some other picture of him playing? What are your thoughts on Ferguson winning Player of the Year? But let's go ahead and jump into some hands, and there are some good ones from day 6 of the World Series of Poker. Now, our first hand we're going to look at today was actually a day 5 hand, but it's a fantastic hand, so I want to talk about it a bit before we jump into day 6. This hand begins at 30,000, 60,000 blinds, with Mikey Kraft coming in for an open in early position to 125,000. Michael Rubin then 3-bets from mid position, and Kraft calls, and they see a flop of 7-6-4. Here, Kraft lead moves all in for 1.5 million, quite an overbet here on the flop, and Rubin calls. They table their hands, and Kraft has 7 deuce off, and Rubin has 9s. 9s gets the hold, and then Rubin obviously moves up to 4.3 million, while Mikey Kraft is eliminated from the tournament. Now look, I understand wanting to play the 7 deuce game, okay? It's a great game, but you're in the World Series of Poker main, you're trying to put a deep run together, maybe let the worst hand to no limit hold'em go here, pre-flop at really any opportunity, and if you're gonna play, I guess raise, right? I mean, I guess I would like a 4-bet pre-flop more than a flat, although it's kind of hard to really decide which one we like more. Now, I will say that on this stack size for Rubin, I don't think he has too difficult of a situation. When you're facing this donk lead, it's kind of unlikely it's an overpair. Although you have to think that there's maybe some chance he's slow playing jacks or 10s because he didn't want to get it in pre and then was waiting for some good flops. But at the same time, with pocket 9s, definitely going to have to call here. Pretty standard on his side, and he ends up moving up to 4.3 million. But look, guys, 7 deuce off game, not in effect in case you didn't know in the World Series of Poker main event. So let that one go pre and live to fight another day. I do want to give a quick shout out to Mikey Kraft, though, who after busting left the tournament area and then came back with a tray of shots, giving a shot to each player, some drinking them, some protesting. Look, if you're going to bust and you're going to go get shots at the table and bring them back, that's what poker is all about, the gambling spirit. Maybe not the 7 deuce off necessarily, but shout out to Mikey Kraft for being an all-around great dude. The first hand we're going to take a look at from day 6 is a hand played between Scott Stewart and Daniel Turner. The hand begins at 60,000, 120,000 blinds, with Scott Stewart raising at 245,000 and Daniel Turner defending his big blind. Now, we don't exactly know which seat Scott Stewart's in. Let's just, for the sake of this example, assume that it's somewhere in mid to late position. Now, Turner defends his big blind, and the flop is Queen 7-7 with a flush draw. Both players check, and now Turner bets on a turn 9. 9 of hearts, not creating a backdoor flush draw. He bets 250,000, and Stewart calls. The river is an offsuit 5. At this point, Turner bets 720,000, and Stewart raises to 1.9 million. Now, let's kind of talk about what I think each player is sort of representing with these bets. Now, when Scott checks back the flop, he's saying he either has something like maybe a few super huge monster hands, like maybe a hand like queens or sevens, but in general has something kind of like jacks or tens, maybe some kind of ace high, or perhaps a really bad hand that didn't even want to bet the flop. Now that's not as likely when it's a mid position open, but in general there should be a few of those hands in his check back range. When Turner bets the 9 and then the 5, he's basically saying that he has a good queen or better. If he had a weak queen, I would expect him to maybe check the turn or possibly bet the turn, check the river. Now, you could maybe make an argument if you had a hand like queen 4 in Turner's shoes to bet turn and bet river, but the thing is, if you do that, then you're not going to have enough hands in your check range to protect against a delayed continuation bet. Additionally, you have to be over half of the call downs, and if you just pro barrel here in Turner's shoes, it's going to be kind of hard to get called by too many hands. Although, the sizes he used were a bit on the smaller side, as they usually are in tournaments. So I think it's fair to say Turner's saying he has somewhere between a decent queen, or maybe a 7, or perhaps even a hand like 8-6, that river to straight. These are all hands that he could potentially have, obviously any 7 as well. So when Turner bets twice and Stewart raises the river, I have to say I'm not a huge fan of his raise size. 720K from Turner, and then 1.9 million from Stewart. And the reason that I'm not a huge fan of this size is that it is such a small raise in relation to the pot that Turner cannot really fold many of his value bets. Now, he'll fold his bluffs for sure, and then after that he has to decide how many of his value bets does he have to call. If he's creating his river range appropriately, then he should already have 2 or 3 value bets for every bluff. So in general, he can let go of a few value bets, but not too many. And maybe that's what Stewart's going for. Maybe he thinks Turner will either fold all of his queens, or he'll fold none of his queens if he's doing it for value. But either way, it's going to be important that Turner knows how to decipher which hand should be calls or not. Now, against this small-sized raise, if he ever does have a 7, which he did have in this hand, he had 8-7, those hands are going to be very clear calls because, you block a hand like 7-7 that could have trapped, or maybe Queen 7 suited that could have trapped at some point as well, or maybe even a hand like Ace-7 that decided to check back and then look to raise an later street. So you have quite good removal with a 7. When it comes to calling that raise. The question is, which queens should you call? Now, in general, I think you're going to want to call queens that block potential boats that your opponent can have. So, for example, Queen 9 will be a much stronger bet and then call a raise than Queen 8. And the reason is that you want to block hands like 9-9 specifically. That's one of the major hands that Stewart's representing on this river when he decides to raise. So Stewart could maybe have Queen occasionally, maybe a Queen 7 or 7-7 occasionally, but he's mainly saying that he has a hand like 9-9 or perhaps 5-5 if he's floating that loose on the turn. Now, Stewart had pocket 4, so he's definitely going to be floating 5s. And all in all, I don't hate Stewart's decision to raise here. And I know that sounds kind of spewy, right? It's like you have pocket 4s, can't you just let it go? Well, Stewart's bluff raises need to have hands that don't block some of the bluffs his opponent can have. So, for example, Stewart doesn't want to have a hand with a 10 in it or a jack in it because those are cards that his opponent could be bluffing with to bet turn and bet river. He also doesn't really want to have a hand like a club because if his opponent has 2 clubs, they might bet turn and bet river. So I think I would prefer to use a hand like 6s over 4s where you actually block the straights. But he has 4s with no club. It's actually a kind of reasonable bluff candidate. Now, personally, I think I'd pick a bit of a bigger size. Maybe make some of those 7s feel kind of indifferent between calling or folding. But if you were going to have the small raise size, which I think is totally fine too, I think this is an okay choice. I think I'd prefer some hands like 6s or maybe even 8s. You could maybe argue 8s doesn't block enough of the bluffs. or blocks too many bluffs rather. But either way, I think that this was a pretty reasonable hand played by both players. A little loose on the call turn pro from Stewart and a little loose on the river, but again, probably just fine plays. And I know that was long-winded, but I want to give you guys a good breakdown for what I think about this hand. So we have another hand from early on in the day that was crazy, and let's break it down a little bit. Now this actually happened at 50,000, 100,000, and Cosmin Joldis raises from 225,000 in late position, and was called by Marcel Lusk in the cutoff and Karen Sarkassian on the button. The flop came king-queen 4 with 2 diamonds, and it checked around. The turn's the deuce of hearts, Joldis and Lusky check, and Sarkassian bets 450,000. After a long pause, Joldis check raises to 1.25 million. Lusky got out of the way, and Sarkassian thought for a bit and called. The river is an offsuit 7, and after several seconds, Joldis moved all in with Sarkassian covered. Sarkassian called rather quickly, and the cards were shown on their back. Let's just have a little think about what the line is. So this hand began with Joldis opening it up in late position, probably the hijack, and then checking through the flop and check raising the turn. Now, what kinds of hand is he representing with this line? Well, on the deuce turn, it could be possible he decides to go for some value with a hand like ace, king, or aces, but in general, I would expect those hands to be betting on the flop or turn. So what kinds of hands make some sense to check raise? Maybe a hand like deuces, where he turns a deuce, and it's still more likely his opponent could have a hand like a king or a queen and call a check raise. Or maybe even a hand like kings or fours for some of the same reasons. Now, again, those hands should mainly be betting the flop or mainly be betting the turn, but those might be some reasonable choices for value. What kinds of hands make sense as bluffs? Well, in general, you're not going to want to have cards like a jack or a 10 as much as possible, because hands like ace jack, ace 10, jack 10 suited, jack 9 suited, those might be the kinds of bluffs that your opponent can have. However, you do want to preferably have some equity, so I would say that if you were going to use anything as a bluff check raise, I wouldn't mind seeing some of the wheel aces. Ace 5 suited, ace 3 suited, if you're not going to bet those on the turn, could be reasonable to check raise with as well. But my personal favorite bluff, if you're going to work one in, is ace deuce suited. And the reason is that because you block deuces, you now, your opponents are much less likely to be nutted. You know, they only have one combo of deuces instead of 3. So I think that if you had ace deuce suited and you want to balance the strategy out, it would be just fine. Now, we don't know how often they're doing it for value. If they're doing it a lot for value, then maybe you could work in more bluffs. But in general, in these check raise weird kind of spots, you don't want to pick out too many bluffs, because then it's easy to be over bluffing. As far as Sarkassian, what you should be calling down with, I think in general you want to check a couple King X hands back on the flop, so that if this does happen and you have a hand like King Jack or King 10 or maybe King 9 suited, you can have a couple bet calls. It's also worth noting maybe a hand like Ace Queen could be a pretty reasonable call down, because if your opponent decided to take this line with Ace King or aces, you have some more removal against that. Although the ace might go either way, maybe he would bluff with hands with an ace in them. I could see kind of an interesting argument either way there. You definitely don't have to call down with hands like Queen Jack, Queen 10. Those block some of the potential bluff hands your opponent can have. And you simply have enough stronger holdings like deuces, a couple weak kings, and then your strongest queens. Now, at showdown, Joldis shows pocket 10s. So he basically turned 10s into a bluff and went for the check raise. And Sarkassian shows pocket 7s and rivered a set. So this move was 100% going to work unless the river was a 7, which is pretty ridiculous if you ask me. I'm not a huge fan of Joldis' play here with the 10, especially with a diamond. You want your opponent to have hands like straight draws or flush draws, and I know those hands are more likely to bet the flop, but I still think if you were going to make a play with 10s, I'd prefer to not have that diamond. And really, honestly, I think I'd probably not want to have 10s at all. I mean, look, you also kind of want them to have hands like Queen Jack, Queen 10 suited. So, yeah, these 10s specifically block 3 of the 4 possible combos of Queen 10 suited now between the Queen on the board and the 2 10s. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but the point remains, pretty aggressive bluff, extremely bold call with pocket 7s. I don't exactly know what he was thinking there. You can have tons of better hands. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure why he even bet to begin with. Like, the turn almost seems like a value bluff to me, because if he gets action, he's beat. And if he gets folds, he was ahead. Don't see too much merit in betting there. In fact, his opponent decided to bluff with a hand that had 7s beat. So pretty insane hand. Extremely lucky river to get all the way up to 12 million. I mean, oh man, his opponent has to be devastated that this was the river. But again, that's poker. Our next hand happened at the 60,000, 120,000 blind level as well. And it was between Scott Blumstein and Scott Stewart. Blumstein opened the hijack at 250,000 and Scott Stewart 3-bet in the small blind to 825,000. Blumstein makes the call, and then the flop becomes 10-6-4. Stewart bets 760K, and Blumstein calls. The turn's an offsuit 9, the rainbow flop, and now a flush draw hits on the turn. And Stewart fires again for 1.66 million. Blumstein then calls the turn, and the river is the ace of clubs, bricking the flush draw, and Stewart fires again for 2.6 million. Blumstein finally calls the 4th time, and Stewart announces, "You got it," and shows Jack 5 off, and Blumstein tables ace queen. Okay, so some pretty bold play going on here across the board. I think ace queen, certainly standard pre-flop, certainly standard on the flop. The question is, should he be calling the turn? I kind of think he's got enough better hands to call with. He can have ace-x of hearts. He can have, pair plus straight draw. I don't mind occasionally calling some ace-high hands, but if you're going to call a lot of these, then you're going to get, what are you going to fold? You have to fold some hands in the turn, right? Ace-queen, not a bad place to start. And then, of course, on the river, definitely standard to call there. But what on earth was Stewart doing here, Scott Stewart doing with Jack 5 off? That is insanity. Easy laydown. You should fold Jack 5 suited there. And I mean, I imagine that there's some degree of, deep stack stuff going on. But look, you know what? When you get deep in a tournament, don't just start going psycho with random hands. When you're in the small blind facing a hijack open, you should probably play around 15% of your hands or 20% of your hands, depending on the antes. So don't ever put Jack 5 off in there. You just don't need to do that. We're up to the 100,000, 200,000 blind level now, and we have a pretty sweet hand here from Valentin Messina. He opens up to 450,000 on the button, and Michael Slanika defends the big blind. The check player check called 500,000 on King Queen 3 with 2 diamonds and 1 heart, and both players checked a queen pairing the board on the turn. The river is a 9 of hearts, and Slanika bets 800,000, and Messina makes it 3.8 million to go. Slanika draws a deep breath, goes into the tank. 9s, he asks, etc. Tanks for a bit. I have the worst value hand, and then folds. And Messina shows him the 8-5 off. The nothing burger coming in for the bluff raise on the river. Okay, so a lot to talk about here in this hand. For starters, in general, you should probably not be opening 8-5 off on the button unless you think that your opponents are extremely weak. Okay, so that's for starters. Second off, on King Queen 3, betting 8-5 with a diamond is loose, but it's acceptable. If you're going to be betting all of these hands, you're going to have way too many flop bluffs. So wouldn't mind seeing a check, but bet is also reasonable. When Slanika check calls the flop, we don't know what he has, so it's kind of hard to say specifically. But the turn being a queen is actually quite a favorable card for him. I wouldn't mind seeing some leading. You could just to lead all your hands, lead some hands. I think leading this turn with some various holdings could be a pretty good play. The 9 of hearts river is a situation where when you bet as Messina, you're kind of saying you can beat a king, okay? Because on the button, if you have a hand like king jack or king 10, you're not going to bet that turn queen because your opponent can have any queen that beats you. So to bet this river, he should have hands like most of his queens, or maybe a hand like jack 10, or maybe a hand like pocket 3s. He didn't want to check raise the flop. Now, when Messina raises, and this is a fairly sizable raise, he actually can let some value bets go. And you can see here in the chat, he says, I have the worst value hand, which means like of the hands I'm betting for value, I have my worst one. When Messina makes it 3.8 million, you can absolutely let go of some of those value bets because your opponent's not getting great odds on this bluff. Now, the question is, what is he representing? Well, he's kind of saying he has a hand like jack 10, or a hand like king queen or king king that checked back the flop, checked back the turn rather when he voted. He's not really representing 9s, even though his opponent says that. I think 9s is mainly going to just check the flop back. I don't really see betting hands on the flop doing too much for him. So he's representing Jack 10, King King, King Queen, maybe even a hand like Queen Queen, although I think that hand might not raise as big, because if you raise big with Queen, it's kind of hard to get calls. Anyway, I don't think that he should ever be bluffing with a hand like 8-5. If you're going to bluff raise this river, first off, you don't want to have a diamond, which he has, because you want your opponent to be bluffing with some missed flush draws. So having the diamond isn't very good. And then after that, you're going to want to block some hands like boats or straights. And, you know, a nice hand to bluff here might be a hand like Jack 9 of clubs, where you don't block any of the diamond hands that can be bluffing. You don't block maybe some backdoor heart floats. You do block Jack 10. You do block 9-9 and Queen 9. You really want to block those hands that are going to snap call you if you raise, because if the big blind bets Jack 10 or Queen 9, those hands are always calling a raise. So I'd prefer to see Jack 9 or 10-9 be the kind of bluffs for the button to raise with. I do like where his head's at. You know, I'm a big fan of players being too aggressive rather than too timid, but I just don't think this hand makes too much sense in that decision. But, you know, showed some power, right? Showed a little bit of power. That's always worth something. We're going to take a look at one more hand here before we look at some chip stacks. And this hand is going to be between Dan Ott and John Hess. The hand begins with Dan Ott raising to $550,000 from middle position, and John Hess 3-betting to $1.2 million in the small blind with Ott calling. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this size 3-bet. It's so small that the player that opens is going to have to call you with most of their holdings, and they're in position. You kind of want to avoid this situation. I'd prefer to see him make it a little more like 1.4, 1.6, 1.7 million, give him not such a great price, and that way you allow yourself to bluff more. If you give them such a good price they have to continue, your ability to bluff goes down a ton, because guess what? You're not getting a fold. So don't really like that size pre-flop, but let's move on to the flop. The flop comes 9-4-3 with 2 hearts, and Hess decides to bet 1.5 million with Ott calling. The turn is the 7 of spades. Hess bets 2 million, which is kind of a peculiar bet, to be frank. To be honest with you, like, I feel like this is a spot where you should bet either a little bit bigger or be checking. 2 million is something around 1/4 of the pot or 1/3 of the pot. If you're going to be betting that small in relation to the pot out of position, I think in general I'd prefer to go with a check. But either way, he bets 2 million and Ott calls. The river is the queen of spades, bricking that flopped flush draw, and Hess bets 2 million again. Probably even more so on the river. I'd prefer a check than betting 2 million. You know, fire something hefty. You know, make him think about the decision, or you know, put it into the check range to play some later streets. Anyway, Ott does make the call, and Hess shows Queen 9 off, which, you know, pre-flop, okay, so it's definitely too loose, I think, but compared to Jack 5 earlier, looks snug. I think I'd prefer to mix in some Queen Jack or Queen 10s if you're going to throw this into your arsenal. But against a mid-position open, you really don't have to do that. You know, you could pick some better hands than Queen 9 off to go with it here. And this is kind of an overriding theme that I wanted to say quickly before we look at some stacks. You know, when you're playing a tournament and you're deep in it, you don't have to just have these wild card hands where you just go for it out of left field with some random hand just to show that you're going to try and win chips. And I know sometimes it feels like everyone's going for it and like, you got to go for it to get the gold. But look, here's the thing. You know, we see all of the times that it goes successfully because they tend to be the bigger hands, right? We see more chips in the pot. We see the showdown. So we see, we're more likely to see these hands when they go well. Jack 5 admittingly did not go well. You don't ever have to make these plays. You really don't. You know, and I know that there's a lot of ICM pressure going on to where you might want to bluff wider than normal in some spots, by all means. But you never have to go crazy with some of these holdings to be a great player. You know, I basically never do this. I can't say never. I'm sure there's some hand that I've played somewhere where I go crazy pre-flop, but you know, I don't really do this stuff, and you don't have to be a great tournament player. So don't think that if you see this deep in the main, you should be doing it. Think to yourself, this is a tournament you're going to want to play. All right, so we have our end of day chip counts here, ending day 6. We have Christian Pham in first place, 31 million. Valentin Messina in second with 29 million. Jack Sinclair in third with 27.5 million. Ben Lamb in fourth with 26 million. And then a couple other players right around the 20 million mark. As far as notable players that remain in here, unfortunately for us, Dario Sammartino was eliminated from the tournament, as well as Kenny Hallert. So that means that Chris Ferguson will be our World Series of Poker Player of the Year? I don't know. Sure. I think I know what that banner might look like.
The world's gonna know your name, and you'll be on the walls of the Hall of Fame.
Also still in the hunt is Michael Rubin, last year's November 9er. We could see a back-to-back November 9. Haven't seen that since Mark Newhouse. Of course, he got back-to-back 9s. Not exactly the way you want to make the final table twice. That's going to do it for me here analyzing day 6 of the main. If you'd like to see the same thing analyzing day 7 from 27 players down to 9, look at a few interesting hands, talk about some players, some stacks, all that kind of stuff, let me know in the comments below, and we might make another one of these tomorrow so that you guys can have an idea of what's coming into the November 9, or I guess the July 9. Doesn't have the same ring to it. Also, one last thing before you go. I did a short skit video with Dave Tuckman.
Stupidest way you've ever injured yourself.
I had a girlfriend in 8th grade, and I decided that it wasn't working for me. So I said, you know what? We're going to ride along here in Las Vegas. If you're interested in checking it out, you can see it in the description below. All right, I'll see you guys later today for the giveaway. Someone's getting lucky. I'll see you there at 7 p.m.